Continuing our reading in Hellbent for Election by Phyllis Speshock, Chapter 27. And then I seemed to pass through a long tunnel, which became narrower and narrower. It was very dark, and at the tiny round opening at the very end of it, I saw a small flickering light, like a bulb dangling crudely from the ceiling, swayed by drafts and currents. Alexis was not with me. His little finger would have plugged the tunnel and filled it with such brilliant radiance that, in the confined area, would have blinded and agonized any occupants. Terror and panic seized me. I heard voices at the end of the tunnel, and recalling the reversals preceding my descent, I trembled with fear of the unknown. "Alexis!" I cried out hoarsely, and my voice bounced against the sides of the tunnel and re-echoed here again and again. "I am out here," he said consolingly. "I can hear you, Hellbent. Do not worry. I will not leave you until you have safely arrived at your destination." "You've put me down an anthill," I accused. "Go along, Hellbent," he said gently. "We've no time to dally." I knew that if I attempted escape, he would have blocked the outside opening. It was either stay in the tunnel, which sooner or later I reasoned would become clogged with such presences as myself, or else go down and join the group at the other end. Stealthily, feeling my way with my hands against the warm, dry wall, I moved step by step down to the end of the tunnel. I emerged in what seemed to be a basement. It took a moment for my vision to clear, though I never did see everything clearly at once. Only one thing at a time, and the rest of it in a haze, like actors stepping to the middle of the stage and then retiring to the shadowy sidelines. The single bulb hanging from the ceiling was not moving at all, but only appeared to move as gusts of mist and smoke obliterated it now and again. The air was thick and stifling, pregnant with the odor of earth, burning, and perspiration. The ceiling was very low, and there was no windows. Heat and smoke and mist, which I recognize now as a kind of steam, seemed to emanate from the very walls, for there were no other openings. I stood there blinking, trying to make out the still, gazy forms in the room, for they had all become quite silent when I entered, and suddenly someone said, "Well, do sit down. The meeting has been held up long enough as it is." I turned my attention in the direction from which the voice had come, and saw glaring at me a sharp-featured hag. "Sit down," she cackled again. "Have you no respect? This is a worship service." I edged over to the splintery bench and sat down beside her. "Now pay attention," she snapped, looking toward the front with an air of superiority. "Oh, pay attention yourself," a female voice in front of us shrilled. "You break up every meeting with that big mouth of yours." She turned around and I gasped. She was as obviously a portrayal of a harlot as I have ever seen. Her hair was brittle with red dye, and her face in that nebulous light looked like a Halloween mask. Her dress was black and profusely decorated with fringe. Her face contorted and her arm reached out. It took me a moment of confusion to decide that she was smiling and beckoning. "You can sit with me if you wish," she said sweetly. "Ha!" cried the hag. "Sit by yourself, all right. Everybody here knows what your game is. If you'd be a little more spiritual, we might be able to concentrate long enough to get through." "If I'd be a little more spiritual," screamed the harlot, getting to her feet, "everybody knows you sit in the back row, so you can fleece every newcomer in the hope of snuffling that corncob pipe one more time. You took the oath with all the rest of us that you'd swear it off." "And so did you," said the hag, rising to look her in the eyes. "But I see every man that comes in the back door." The harlot reached out and slapped the hag's face. The hag pulled up the sleeves of her ragged sweater and grabbed a handful of the harlot's red hair. They began to snarl and growl, a tangle of fists and claws and flailing limbs. I got to my feet and backed away. Somehow, I seemed to be backing toward the front of the room, up the center aisle. Someone tripped me and I fell on my back. Several of them laughed loudly. You had that coming, said the red-faced fat man who stood above me. But get up out of the way before I kick you, or we'll never get this meeting to order. Every time we settle down and try to get through, some new devil comes in and the fracas starts all over again. I scurried to one side for fear he would step on me, and he promptly went back and took the two women by the hair of their heads, cracked them soundly together, and sat them down with a jerk. There followed a roar of applause and cheering, and then they all turned toward the front again. The fat man came wheezing back to resume his position on the bench, and seeing me there, said, "Get out of the way, you fool, and go sit across the aisle." I got up to do as he said, and perched gingerly at the end of the bench across from him. I was no sooner seated than a voice hissed in my ear, "You got a deck of cards and a little cash on you, brother?" I turned quickly, and a very personable young man, with thick wavy hair and very pale white teeth, moved his hands completely before my eyes. No, I said, sorry. His face at once became cruel and hateful. "Then what makes you think you can squat here, I'd like to know?" And he gave me a shove that sent me to the fat man's lap. I thought the fat man would surely pulverize me, but he only laughed jovially and whispered, "Bring any food with you?" But I shook my head no. He sent me up the aisle, sprawling. Several faces peered at me. One of them spit at me. I think he had consumption. Another pricked up me by the neck and whispered raggedly, "Got a flask on you?" Then shoved me back down. I crawled a few feet on my hands and knees, uncertain as to whether it would be worthwhile to attempt standing. Then the voice of an elderly gentleman said kindly, "You can sit here, son, beside me." I looked up at the vacant spot he indicated and then carefully crept to a position beside him. "Now be quiet, son," he said, "and there will be no more trouble. Once we can maintain peace long enough to get through." A gavel sounded at the front of the room, and searching through the stench and vapor, I saw a man in priestly garb standing up behind a pulpit. "Why?" I whispered to the gentleman beside me. Are we all playing church?" He turned to me smiling and said, "Son, you should not have said playing. It infuriates me to be taken lightly." And then without another word, he closed his hands about my throat and began strangling me, while the others looked on and laughed. He twisted and turned and squeezed his hands together with all his might, and somehow I remained the same, except that I was in a rather embarrassing upside-down position through it all. At last he flung me away while the others laughed still louder, and I realized that he was a murderer, a sweet-faced old murderer, but wholly incapable of killing again, just as the fat man was incapable of eating, and the card shark incapable of gambling, the drunk incapable of drinking, the harlot incapable of sex, the hag incapable of chewing or smoking. It was a place housing the acme of physical frustrations. I don't know where I am," I said to all of them in general. I didn't think I wanted to go above. That is, in the first place, it seems, yet it seems, well, you call this a worship service? I thought I came down, but possibly it was some underground passage leading up." "Do you mean," someone asked, "you had a choice?" Well, of course, I said, "Everyone has a choice." "He's a liar," said the card shark. "No one ever asked me." "Me either," said the drunk. "Closest I ever come to asking anyone was me, with a woman with a tambourine who came around collecting." "I was asked," said the murderer, "but it didn't seem worth it." "I went to church once," yelled the harlot. "They got up and moved away from me." "No wonder," cackled the hag, and then they all started fighting and scrabbling again. It took quite a while before they settled down. The gavel finally did the trick. They sat one by one and faced the front. I seemed to have found a spot beside a polite, middle-aged woman. "Those of us who were church members," she whispered, "have to set an example for the others." Then, I began doubtfully, You are a believer?" "Oh, of course," she said quickly. We are all believers. I stared at her. Then I am in. Oh my, no, she said. We are all believers, but we believe too late. You see, once you come down here, there is no more doubting him. We have it on authority that he exists and that his way is the only way. The problem is establishing contact. The Reverend up there in the front knows the how of it better than any of the rest of us, being shepherd to one of the largest churches in the country. But if he was a shepherd and you were a church member, well, she said, beginning to fidget, if you're going to be that way about it, but I'm not being any way about it. I simply wondered, well, if you think you're better than we are, that's the way it was on earth, you know. Some of those plain little churches came around preaching supernatural nonsense about believing and accepting when we knew perfectly well that doing the nicest and kindest deeds. But surely you know now. She shot to her feet and said loudly, I demand that this troublemaker be removed. And she began to pommel the top of my head with her fists. At once the shouts and hurrahs began again. The hag and the harlot got into another tangle. The fat man reached over and belted the drunk. The murderer started in on the card shark. I could see these as I turned my head from side to side to avoid the blows. But there were many other struggling figures only partially visible in the filmy edges of the miasma. It took, more than once, a long time getting them settled. By the time the gavel sounded again, I was on the opposite side of the aisle and still nearer the front. A nervous man sitting next to me started to pick at me. Don't mind him, said a voice behind me. He's a thief. And another uproar began. I'll thank you to mind your own stinking business, the thief hollered, turning to the woman in the back of us. If you hadn't been so busy breaking up your son's marriages and worming money and pity out of them, maybe you'd have had a little time to believe before it was too late yourself. That's right, shouted the harlot. She thinks that because her sin didn't show, she can sit up there in front and pretend to be closer to him than the rest of us. That would be what you know about, yelled the hag. Your sins were worse than mine, and you sit up there ahead of me, don't you? All I ever did was bootleg a little corn whiskey. Didn't even touch the stuff myself. Just ran a quiet little business so my young'uns would have security. Sat on my own back porch and minded my own business. And then why don't you try minding it down here? Cried the harlot, reaching for her. Why don't you? Shrieked the meddler, coming down the aisle to enter the battle. Why don't you all just sit down and shut up? Bellowed the fat man, taking a swing at the murderer. It's plain enough we're all down here because we were too busy at the other things to listen to him or believe him. It wasn't that way at all, sniped the card shark. Those who didn't know just never cared about those like me. If you'd like to come out of that back room long enough to see the light of day, said the murderer, you would have noticed signs all over. People on street corners, missions. Oh, listen who's talking about the light of day, laughed the card shark. An old rabbit who spent his time hopping down alleys strangling people. Don't laugh at me, screamed the murderer. I won't stand for it. He lunged at the card shark, who sidestepped and grabbed instead the drunk. The drunk only laughed and permitted himself to strangle away while he himself reached out and gave the meddler a swat. The gavel sounded again, and this time I seemed to be standing in the aisle while they took their seats. I turned then to the front and faced the shepherd, who looked strangely like a great auk, standing there in his dark garb. I don't belong here, I croaked. I'm a believer. That is, I was even before I came down here. I never stopped believing. I spent years studying. The only reason I'm here is because I don't want to be anywhere. The words were harsh and cutting when they came through my throat. The shepherd only said, Call me Reverend. I looked at him and blinked. No, said I. I can't, because you aren't. If you had been. But then they all leaped up from their benches and started yelling and shaking their fists, some for me, some against me. Let him have a go at it, said the fat man. The Reverend ain't been doing so hot. "Do not blaspheme," said the good deed doer. "The Reverend comes from one of the largest churches." "Yeah?" said the drunk. "Then what's he doing down here? I say give this skinny little mutt a chance. We've been here for years, and so far all the Reverend does is pound his gavel and say, 'Call me Reverend.' He can't get through it because he don't know how. See, he don't know how." The gavel sounded again, and some of them sat down. Others milled toward the front, shoving me along with them. I don't know what would have happened if suddenly the tunnel door at the back had not opened, and with a gust of clear, warm air admitted a young man in what appeared to be a leather jacket. The whole crowd turned and concentrated upon him, and he stood exactly as I had and strained to see around the room. The hag spoke first. "Sit down," she said to him. "Can't you see there's a worship service? Sit down and pay attention." He seemed more reluctant than I had been. His eyes shifted about suspiciously. The harlot spoke up. "You can sit by me if you wish." Her voice was honeyed with, and she gestured and beckoned as she had to me. "I ain't got none of that junk on me," the young man answered angrily. "And I didn't steal it neither. I was on my way home after a legitimate purchase when these mugs grabbed me and knifed me in the back. Besides, I was going to swear off this stuff after this time. So I am down here in this hole?" "Well," spat the good deed doer, "if you think you're better than we are." "Oh, I had a daughter-in-law just like you," said the meddler, "always shooting off her mouth. I don't see why my son never understood the favor I did him." "Got a flask on you?" asked the drunk. "Bring a deck of cards and some cash, brother?" asked the card shark. "Got a candy bar in your pocket?" asked the fat man. "Come, son," said the murderer. "You can sit by me." And then the gavel sounded, and the shepherd said in a monotone, "Call me Reverend." Suddenly, I saw how it would be through all eternity. It would go on and on and on. They would never make contact. They would quarrel and bicker and snarl and lash out. They would fight and attempt to kill. But they would live on and on, forever writhing beneath the anguish of their own personal frustration. The God each of them had put before him on earth was now just out of reach down here. Only the hunger remained, setting them on edge and sustaining the hope that each new arrival could bring fulfillment. And I, because I had yearned after an eternity free from believers with terrestrial characteristics, was condemned to eternity with believers possessing subterranean characteristics. The words of the chief counselor rang in my ear. "Once condemned to hell, you could not howl and come back up here." And still knowing this, I somehow had to make a clean break of them before him. So while the others pressed to the back toward the attic, and while the shepherd stood woodenly clutching his gavel, I sank to my knees in the aisle and cried out hoarsely, my God, why have I forsaken you?" And there was an immediate stillness, followed by weeping and gnashing of teeth. Suddenly the door to the tunnel was flung wide, sending a shaft of light in from above. "We have established contact," one of the women screamed, and then they all ran headlong toward the open door. But somehow, though they clawed and screamed and climbed over one another, none of them could seem to get through the open door. I heard a voice say, "Come." And with joy leaping in my heart, I walked through the mob, which seemed to be a mass of arms and legs twisted and nodding and helpless as intertwined reptiles, and I entered into the foot of the tunnel. That's the end of chapter 27.